Hi, welcome to Professional Certifications channel. Let's break down CISSP exam preparation, one topic a day for focused and effective learning. Today's topic is vulnerability.
Definition: a vulnerability is a weakness, flaw, or gap in a system, process, network, or application that can be exploited by a threat actor to gain unauthorized access, disrupt operations, or cause harm. Vulnerabilities can exist in hardware, software, configurations, or human processes and are a crucial component in assessing an organization's risk.
Key concepts.
1. Types of vulnerabilities. Software vulnerabilities, flaws or weaknesses in software code that can be exploited by attackers. Common examples include buffer overflows, occur when more data is written to a buffer than it can hold, allowing an attacker to overwrite adjacent memory and potentially execute malicious code. SQL injection involves inserting malicious SQL queries into a web application's input fields to manipulate the underlying database. Cross-site scripting, XSS, involves injecting malicious scripts into a website that executes in the user's browser, often to steal session cookies or sensitive data. Unpatched software, software that hasn't been updated with security patches, leaving it vulnerable to known exploits. Hardware vulnerabilities, physical or logical weaknesses in hardware components that can be exploited to compromise the system. Examples include Meltdown and Spectre, processor vulnerabilities that allow attackers to access sensitive data in memory. Firmware bugs, flaws in the hardware's firmware that attackers can exploit to gain low-level access to systems. Configuration vulnerabilities, improper system or network configurations that create security weaknesses. Examples include default passwords, leaving default credentials unchanged on systems or devices, making them easy for attackers to compromise. Open ports, exposing unnecessary or vulnerable services via open network ports that can be exploited by attackers. Improper file permissions, misconfiguring access control, allowing unauthorized users to read, modify, or delete sensitive data. Human vulnerabilities, weaknesses in human behavior, such as lack of training, negligence, or failure to follow security policies. Examples include Phishing attacks, attackers trick individuals into revealing confidential information, e.g., login credentials, by impersonating legitimate entities. Social engineering, manipulating individuals to gain unauthorized access to information or systems. Weak passwords, using easily guessable or reused passwords across multiple systems. Physical vulnerabilities, weaknesses in the physical security of assets. Examples include Unsecured facilities, inadequate physical protection of data centers or offices, leading to unauthorized access to equipment. Device theft, loss or theft of devices like laptops or smartphones containing sensitive information. Lack of environmental controls, inadequate protection from fire, floods, or other environmental threats that could damage infrastructure.
2. Vulnerabilities in the CIA Triad. Confidentiality vulnerabilities, weaknesses that allow unauthorized access to sensitive data, such as weak encryption, poor access control, or accidental data exposure. Integrity vulnerabilities, weaknesses that allow unauthorized modification of data or system configurations. Examples include tampering with files, introducing malware, or manipulating financial transactions. Availability vulnerabilities, weaknesses that allow attackers to disrupt access to services or systems, such as insufficient redundancy, lack of disaster recovery plans, or susceptibility to denial of service (DOS) attacks.
3. Common vulnerability types in cybersecurity. Zero-day vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities that are unknown to the vendor or have not been patched. These are particularly dangerous because there are no fixes available, and attackers may exploit them before they are addressed. Known vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities that have been identified and disclosed but may remain unpatched or unmitigated, leaving systems at risk. Legacy systems, older systems that are no longer supported or patched by vendors, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. 4. Vulnerability scanning and testing. Vulnerability scanners, automated tools that scan networks, applications, or systems for known vulnerabilities. Common vulnerability scanning tools include Nessus, Qualys, and OpenVAS. Penetration testing, simulated cyber attacks conducted by ethical hackers to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited by attackers. Penetration testing helps validate security controls and uncover weaknesses that automated scanners might miss. Security audits, comprehensive reviews of security policies, configurations, and systems to identify vulnerabilities and compliance issues.
5. Vulnerability management process. Identification, the process of discovering vulnerabilities through vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, threat intelligence feeds, and security audits. Assessment, evaluating the potential impact and likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited. Vulnerabilities are typically classified based on their severity, using a risk matrix or vulnerability scoring systems like the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS. Prioritization, based on the assessment, vulnerabilities are prioritized for remediation. High-impact vulnerabilities with a high likelihood of exploitation are addressed first. Remediation, implementing security controls or patches to fix or mitigate the vulnerability. Remediation may include patching, updating configurations, strengthening access controls, or improving monitoring. Verification, after remediation, organizations verify that the vulnerability has been properly addressed and the risk has been mitigated. This may involve rescanning or retesting the affected system.
6. Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS. CVSS is a standardized system for rating the severity of vulnerabilities, taking into account factors like exploitability, impact, and the ease of remediation. CVSS scores range from 0, no risk, to 10, critical risk. The score helps prioritize vulnerabilities for remediation by indicating their potential impact on the organization.
7. Vulnerability exploitation. Exploitation occurs when a threat actor uses a vulnerability to gain unauthorized access, disrupt operations, or cause harm to an organization. Exploits can be automated or manual. Exploit kits, prepackaged software used by attackers to target known vulnerabilities in systems. These kits allow less skilled attackers to exploit vulnerabilities quickly and easily.
8. Mitigating vulnerabilities. Patching and updates, regularly applying software patches and updates to fix known vulnerabilities. This is one of the most effective ways to reduce the attack surface. Security configurations, implementing secure configuration standards, e.g., CIS benchmarks, to harden systems and reduce exposure to vulnerabilities. User awareness and training, educating users on security best practices, such as recognizing phishing attempts, using strong passwords, and following security policies. Access control, implementing strict access control policies to limit user permissions and prevent unauthorized access to sensitive resources. Encryption, using encryption to protect sensitive data at rest and in transit, reducing the impact of confidentiality vulnerabilities.
9. Vulnerability disclosure. Responsible disclosure, the practice of reporting vulnerabilities to vendors or organizations in a controlled manner to give them time to develop and release patches before public disclosure. Bug bounty programs. Many organizations offer bug bounty programs, where ethical hackers are rewarded for discovering and responsibly disclosing vulnerabilities in their systems.
10. Vulnerability and risk. A vulnerability by itself does not necessarily pose a risk unless it can be exploited by a threat. Risk occurs when a vulnerability is combined with a threat and impacts an organization's assets. Risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. This formula helps assess the level of risk posed by a vulnerability in the context of potential threats and the damage they could cause if exploited.
Importance in the CISSP exam. Understanding vulnerabilities is crucial for the security and risk management and security operations domains in the CISSP exam. CISSP aspirants must know how to identify, assess, and mitigate vulnerabilities, as well as how vulnerabilities relate to risks and threats. Exam questions may focus on the types of vulnerabilities, software, hardware, configuration, etc., vulnerability scanning, the vulnerability management lifecycle, and how vulnerabilities can be exploited. Familiarity with the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, and the use of tools like vulnerability scanners and penetration testing is also important.
Real-world example: a financial services company conducts a vulnerability scan and discovers that an unpatched version of an open-source web application framework is vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. The company evaluates the risk and determines that the vulnerability could lead to unauthorized access to customer financial data. To mitigate the risk, they apply the latest security patch and update their web application firewall (WAF) rules to block SQL injection attempts.